I'm Jessica Denson, host of Lights On with Jessica Denson. Americans have had it with this corrupt Supreme Court. In a Fox News poll of all places, over 60% of Americans said they disapprove of the Supreme Court of the United States. We are making progress, though, with our politicians willing to make reforms towards these ends. Just this week, we learned that President Biden is open to Supreme Court reform, including term limits, an enforceable ethics code, and possibly a no one is above the law amendment to overturn this obscene ruling on presidential immunity from this extreme right-wing Supreme Court. No one has been tracking the corruption at the Supreme Court more than Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. I am joined today by President of CREW, Noah Bookbinder, to take us on a little trip down memory lane and remind us just how out of bounds the Supreme Court is, and particularly in regards to Justice Thomas. Thank you for joining me, Noah. Welcome back to Lights On.
It's always great to be here.
So we have so many threads to draw on today, really with the tools. This is what I always love to get to with you, Noah, is the tools that we, the people, have to combat this just out of control corruption we've got going on. But let's start off with a trip down memory lane to 2019. The justices are once again on their summer vacation. God knows what Clarence Thomas is doing this summer, but can you remind us what he was doing back in 2019?
Yeah, that's something that our researchers and our lawyers, who have been combing through these records of what Justice Thomas has been up to, kept on coming back to this summer of 2019 because it just seemed so extraordinary. So just after the Supreme Court's term ended in 2019, Justice Thomas set off on a long private jet flight to Indonesia, a private jet paid for by the billionaire Harlan Crow, who, as folks may remember, paid for a whole lot of stuff for Clarence Thomas. That included putting up his mom rent-free in houses that Crow bought from Thomas, and included paying tuition for a relative who was living with Justice Thomas. But in this summer, Crow flies Thomas to Indonesia. They then go on an 8-day yacht trip on Harlan Crow's yacht. So that's also paid for by Crow. Obviously, there's a lot of meals. There's everything that goes into a yacht trip, at least so I gather. I haven't actually done that myself. That is estimated, just that piece of his summer is estimated to have cost at least $500,000. Justice Thomas comes back. Within days of that trip, he is jetted off on Harlan Crow's private jet to California, where he participates in this thing called Bohemian Grove. It's this 2-week all-male retreat with a lot of fancy food and wine and I don't know, meetings, and it's a sort of party and retreat. Crow gets him there, flies him back to Washington. A little bit later in the summer, an entirely different billionaire, also someone interested in how the Supreme Court operates, a guy named David Sokol, flies Justice Thomas on his private jet to Nebraska, where Thomas and other folks who are working on issues of what the court should look like, go to the locker room at a University of Nebraska football game. They enter the field with the team. Soon after that experience, this same guy flies Thomas to a ranch in Montana, where they spend time at a kind of resort area there. And he's flown back to Washington by this billionaire, kind of just in time to start the next Supreme Court session. So for this whole summer, he is jetting literally around the world, being put up at resorts and ranches and on yachts, all paid for by billionaires who care what the Supreme Court does. It's sort of it's kind of hard to imagine. It's the sort of corruption that I think we come up with in our worst nightmares, and this is what Clarence Thomas was up to for a summer.
It's so unjust, such a disgrace to the American people who are living with the consequences of these justices' decisions on such a massive scale. Roe v. Wade, of course, the overturning of that being one glaring example. There are so many more. Noah, I know we're a week or so out from articles of impeachment being filed against Justice Thomas and Justice Alito for their corruption that you have detailed so carefully as well as their refusal to recuse from these cases that they obviously have such an appearance of conflict of interest, which is the standard for recusal. I'm of course talking about the January 6th case, the immunity case, and others. And there is a mechanism. There is a mechanism to hold, even with the existing limits that we have. Impeachment is a mechanism to hold these justices accountable. Of course, we're dealing with a Republican-led House that would never pass these out of its chamber. But what do you think about using tools like impeachment to start the ball rolling on just holding some of this egregious behavior to account?
Yeah. So first of all, the level of egregious behavior is kind of wild here, right? And not only did Justice Thomas accept all of these gifts, but the legal problems come in the fact that he didn't disclose most of them in the way that he's required to do. So that's one thing that's going on. It's also very possible that even the acceptance of some of these gifts is a violation. And then you had both Justice Thomas, whose spouse, Ginny Thomas, was literally texting White House officials in support of efforts to overturn the 2020 election, and actually attended a January 6th event. And Justice Alito, who we now know at several of his houses, displayed flags that showed support for the efforts to overturn the election, flags that were associated with the insurrection. Both of those are, so, the standard is that judges have to recuse when a reasonable person could question their impartiality. In this case, it's hard to argue that a reasonable person not only could, but would question their impartiality. So they should have recused. These were cases, especially this immunity case, but it's not the only one, of enormous national importance. They didn't recuse. And it's not like they didn't know. I mean, we wrote letters saying they had to recuse. Members of Congress wrote letters. This was all over the press. They didn't do it. So, there is this question, that this real sense of both corruption and lawlessness and bias. And you need to be able to do something about it. There has to be some form of accountability. I think that impeachment is tough because there is this standard of high crimes and misdemeanors, as to whether all of this meets that, I think we're certainly looking into that, and I think that those are tough questions. And usually you have an impeachment inquiry where you really dig into the evidence before you get to voting on articles of impeachment. But I think the problem is that we have a system where, because there is no oversight, essentially, of the Supreme Court, there's nobody ensuring that they comply with their new ethics code. Before that, they had none at all. There's no oversight there. There is very little appetite for the executive branch or the legislative branch to do anything with regard to the Supreme Court. There's no inspector general in the judiciary branch. So impeachment is kind of all you have. And even though it seems like a pretty extreme response, and as I said, I think there's some work to be done before you get to that point, where there's almost no other way to have accountability, at some point you have to start thinking about that.
Yeah. Well, I want to pull two threads from what you were just talking about. One is enforceability. oversight, a way to actually enforce the rules that are set down for these justices. And the other is accountability through criminal justice. Now, maybe we can start with the latter. Crew has filed a criminal complaint against Clarence Thomas. You revised it this year with new information. I've heard people like Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who has been one of the staunchest advocates for addressing this corruption in the Supreme Court, talk about the avenues that the Attorney General Cannon should follow as far as Justice Thomas having violated criminal law, tax law. I think your complaint noted that he appears to have violated the Ethics in Government Act, if not more statutes. Can you talk about what could be done to actually hold him to account, possibly criminally, number one? And I feel like we're getting back to this insane scenario where felons can be presidents, but would that have any bearing on his ability to continue operating as a justice if charges were filed and he actually was found to have committed these crimes?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, we do think that there's a lot of evidence that Justice Thomas in particular has committed crimes, that failing to disclose gifts and benefits that you're required to disclose, those are criminal offenses, and a lot of officials are charged with that kind of thing. Not if it's a small thing and if it's inadvertent, but where you have repeated failure to disclose significant gifts. That's a crime. There may be other related crimes. There may be tax implications. There may be violations of federal gift laws. There are a number of potential criminal issues. So we've filed now, as you said, a complaint and then a supplement to that complaint. We know that the Department of Justice is very reluctant to look at Supreme Court justices. There's a sense of separation of powers. There's a sense of, kind of appearance and deference. But this has gotten to a place where the abuses are so extreme and there's such a lack of accountability that somebody needs to do something. And that's why I think it's really good that Senator Whitehouse, as you mentioned, together with Senator Ron Wyden, actually came out and called for a special counsel to be appointed, because I think they acknowledged that, yes, it's true, the Department of Justice appears in front of the Supreme Court all the time. So, of course, they're going to be reluctant to investigate. So appoint somebody separate to do it. And that's an extreme remedy, but these are extreme circumstances. Were that to happen, and there are a lot of ifs there, but were that to happen, were there ultimately to be criminal charges and a conviction? Generally with federal judges, if there is a criminal conviction, generally judges resign. If they don't resign, they are impeached under those circumstances. It's hard to argue with it being a high crime and misdemeanor if there is a conviction, one would have thought, but in general, in American history, that's where we are. But these are such extraordinary times that it's hard to predict anything with too much certitude.
Yeah, Merrick Garland, extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. Please live up to the moment on behalf of the American people, sir. But the other piece of that question that I wanted to follow up on with you is, of course, this news that we're getting from, chatter from President Biden that he may be coming out to endorse reform, that he has previously been reluctant to go forward on the side of. I, for one, am hugely encouraged by this. You're talking about a separation of powers. Lawrence Tribe, who you and I have discussed and has been a guest on the show many times, wrote a piece in The Guardian this week accusing the supermajority of essentially shredding the Constitution and, quote, essentially destroying the framework of checks and balances that has maintained an uneasy equilibrium over the course of our history. This is a 5-alarm fire. President Biden appears to understand this and be willing to campaign and move forward in a second term on Supreme Court reform, including term limits, an enforceable ethics code, and possibly even that constitutional amendment, as I mentioned at the top, to reverse this obscene immunity ruling. I know you have done so much work in terms of enforceable ethics. Can you just talk about how meaningful these possible reforms would be?
They're absolutely essential. I mean, these are all reforms that Crew has endorsed, that Crew has worked towards. So, up until last year, the U.S. Supreme Court was pretty much the only workplace in America without any kind of code of conduct. There was nothing saying what they could or couldn't do. There was finally so much pressure that they did adopt a code of conduct, but it was a code of conduct with a lot of pretty weak generalities and no enforcement. The enforcement essentially was that it said to the justices, if you think you yourself might have an ethics problem, you figure that out and take whatever steps you need to address that. And I think any of us who have kind of lived in the world and worked in a regular workplace understand that even with the least corruptible people in the world, putting everybody in charge of themselves is just not a formula for success. There needs to be somebody external looking over what these folks are doing. And we now have such a track record of, at best, blurring the lines, and in some cases, what looks like clear corruption, that's absolutely essential. So there needs to be somebody doing enforcement on this code of conduct. And then, the other piece is that because of sort of years and years of political maneuvering, we have a Supreme Court that does not reflect who has won presidential elections over the past 30 years. It certainly doesn't reflect the American people and the sort of concerns and preferences of the American people. And it's a group of people who have been in there a very long time, who feel a total sense of impunity. And so they're making these rulings that are not just out of touch, but increasingly extreme and dangerous. And that's where term limits come into place. If you have a system of term limits, it's not this sort of escalating thing of, maybe one party packs the court and then the next party comes in and adds even more people. And this is an entirely fair system where after a period of time, each justice is done and the president appoints a new justice, and it's set up so that every presidential term gets Supreme Court appointments. And so there's, the justices kind of reflect the preferences of whoever the people have elected. So, over time, you would get a Supreme Court that is both more representative and also accountable, also not as far away from the people. So, I think that would be, is that enough? I don't know, but it would sure be a step in the right direction. And, again, I think President Biden has also had sort of separation of powers concerns and hasn't wanted to do something that is seen as attacking the Supreme Court. But I think he is realizing that we're in a crisis period that, as you said, and as, Professor Tribe, who is as much of an expert on this as anybody in the country, has said, the Supreme Court has shredded separation of powers. It doesn't really exist anymore. And so you have to take strong steps to fix this institution and start to restore our system of checks and balances.
Absolutely. Noah, I have to, without letting you go, address one other kind of obscene ruling we got in this torrent of just appalling news that has been coming out of our justice system. This week, Judge Aileen Cannon down in Florida threw out the classified documents case against Donald Trump, former president, felon candidate Donald Trump and his co-defendants, of course, taking the cue of Justice Thomas, where we started, who wrote in his concurrence with that 6-3 majority for the immunity decision that maybe special counsels just don't even have authority in the first place. And that is what Aileen Cannon ruled, basically entirely ignoring the precedent set by Nixon, U.S. v. Nixon, and the circuit court rulings in the Mueller investigation that affirmed that years-long precedent that says absolutely special counsels do have authority. I just kind of have to get your thoughts, Noah, on this throwing out of a case that literally involves our national secrets, our national security, from a judge who has shown every indication of bias, taking a cue from a justice who should have recused from this case in the first place.
I mean, that's right. As a starting point, going first full circle on this conversation that we've had today, if anybody thinks that these ethics issues don't matter, this ought to make that clear. Because Justice Thomas had no business ruling at all on the immunity case because of the clear, at least appearance of conflict of interest, which under law meant that he should have recused. He didn't recuse. He ruled on the decision. Not only did he rule for immunity in this really unprecedented, extreme ruling with no basis that allows a president to essentially do whatever the heck they want with no consequences. But he went further and he wrote this concurring opinion saying, and by the way, there's not even any basis to have a special counsel to investigate a president or a former president or anybody else. So he never should have been there. He never should have been issuing that opinion. It was an ethics problem that he did that. And that, of course, became the basis for Judge Cannon issuing her opinion, throwing out the classified documents case. Judge Cannon's decision is borderline preposterous. There are decades of precedent making clear that it is perfectly proper and constitutional to have a special counsel, that it was done in this case in the way it's been done in lots of other cases, which have been upheld by courts up and down the federal system. There's just simply no basis for it, even on this incredibly extreme and lawless U.S. Supreme Court that we have. Justice Thomas couldn't get anybody else to sign on to him in that extreme opinion. So, even the other really extreme justices wouldn't go that far. So it's a ludicrous decision, but the effect of it, and I expect that it will be overturned and probably overturned relatively quickly and with strong language, but that delays this further. And this is, as you said, a case that implicates our national security, and where having a trial this year is important for our national security. And this judge who again and again either has shown herself to either have no idea what she's doing, or particularly because all of her weird rulings have gone in only one direction, looks to be acting on political bias, has delayed this really important case in a way that could have devastating consequences.
Yeah, unforgivable. Of course, finally giving the opening for Jack Smith to go to the 11th Circuit, but the delay was once again the gift. As always, thank you so much, Noah, for joining me on Lights On. Your work, as we always remind our viewers at Crew, is entirely invaluable. I encourage everybody to check out your work at citizensforethics.org. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you both for having me and for constantly shining a light on these really important issues of democracy.
Absolutely. My pleasure. What could be more important? I want to remind everyone about that Fox News poll that I started with at the top of this short. Of that 60% that disapprove, part of that poll was that 8 in 10 favor establishing a mandatory retirement age for the justices, as well as limiting them to an 8-year term. Around 78% favor that latter one. Both of these numbers are up double digits since July of 2022, which was shortly after Roe v. Wade was overturned. 7 in 10 are extremely or very concerned about the Supreme Court. Folks, there's only one party in this country who is going to be willing to make the reforms that we discussed today. The Republicans have zero interest in it. This is the court that they want. This is the corrupt court that they have funded and packed for decades. And the only way that we get here is by electing the politicians that are willing to do that. That, in this case, in this moment we're living in, is the Democrats, President Biden, to sign that into law. Democrats in the House and the Senate would be needed. Congress would be needed to get this legislation passed. President Biden would be needed to sign it into law. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today and being so invested yourselves in the preservation of our democracy. We, the people, alone hold the keys to fix this. Thanks as always for joining us. You can always find Lights On wherever you get your audio podcasts by looking for Lights On with Jessica Denson, and also by subscribing to Jessica Denson on YouTube. Thanks so much.